Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is The World Unpacked. So, we talk about a fairly wide range of issues on this show. Last year, we had episodes on solar geoengineering, on the French elections, on great power competition in the Middle East. You're welcome to go back into the archives and check out all of those. But as we enter this new year of 2025, I really wanted to take a step back and look at the big themes and trends that are likely going to determine and underlie all our discussions in the year ahead, from technology to political economy, democratic governance, global power dynamics. And I could wish for no better guest to have this conversation with. I'm speaking today with Tino Cuéllar, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm not going to give a long bio, but Tino's career spans public service, academia, global leadership. He has served as a justice of the California Supreme Court, taught and directed at Stanford University, advised in the U.S. government on national security, immigration, regulatory policy. We'll delve into the themes at the heart of this work, I think, the evolving role of technology in governance and democracy, the strategic use of economic tools in an era of heightened international competition, the growing influence of emerging powers in the international system, and how democratic systems and an institution like Carnegie are navigating these crises of trust and resilience. I can't wait. Welcome to The World Unpacked.
Delighted to be here.
Right. So we are in a new year that always comes with a sense of change and transformation, but I have rarely felt this as pronounced as I have this January in D.C. as the transition of power from the Biden administration to the Trump administration is taking place. And you can feel it here and in many places in the world, I think, a sense of anxiety and foreboding about the resilience of U.S. democracy at this moment of transition. There are some signs that a new style of personalized politics, it's sometimes called, seems to be emerging away from established ideological foundations. New for this country, at least. We have, of course, been talking about these styles, democratic backsliding everywhere in the world for a few years now. These next weeks and months, I would argue, are crucial to get a sense of where the U.S. is going, not just in terms of partisan politics, but as a political system and as a regime. And so, Tino, as the president of an institution committed to peace and democracy, how do you think about the significance of this moment? And what are the indicators, what are the sort of guardrails you're looking to determine the direction of the country?
Sophia, what's interesting to me about democracy at the end of the day is that it's never just about campaigning and getting some ideas out in the public domain. It's also about accepting a fundamental contingency of what's going to happen in politics. That may seem like a small thing, but let me just draw it out. I grew up in northern Mexico a lot of my childhood, and at the time I was a young kid, the outcome of just about any election in Mexico was largely preordained. There was a small loyal opposition of parties, the PAN and others, but fundamentally policy was controlled in Mexico at the national level and most of the local level by the PRI, a party whose initials were a contradiction in terms it was the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Go figure, right? Still around in Mexico to this day. But nobody really wondered who was going to win the election in Mexico. The process of coming to the U.S. and getting to know this country reflected an understanding that you don't always get what you want in politics. You might believe that a certain perspective about taxes or education policy or foreign aid or alliances is like the best for the country, and the reality of democracy is that it really doesn't, you can't know in advance what's going to happen, and if you did, either because you knew exactly what party was going to win or because in the end there was so little power for the elected officials that elections really didn't matter, hard to call that a democracy. So now, fast forward to 2024, the year we just finished, where billions of people around the world went to the polls. And in a way, the fact that democracy plays out and that incumbents are not always reelected, and this was a particularly intense anti-incumbent moment, means that there will be change. That's what we ought to expect. Now, in the U.S., one could say there's even more of a sense of that change because the political process that led up to this moment was not entirely ordinary. Who knows exactly what is ordinary, but there was much controversy about one former president who was running for election again and the subject of a lot of lawsuits and concerns about what happened at the tail end of that presidency. And then an incumbent president who dropped out of the race after a disastrous debate performance that highlighted to people that they couldn't necessarily expect a person who was performing that way to carry the baton forward. So that's the big backdrop. But there are two other things to note here. The first one is, at this moment where you've got a new administration about to begin that is led by somebody who has emphasized that a desire to bring change and to not correspond to existing norms at times. There's sort of a question about how far that will go. And many, many people around the country want change. That's partly why they voted the way they did. But the question is sort of how much and in what direction. So to get to the crux of your question, things to watch that will give people a sense of where that change is coming beyond simply legislative priorities or budget priorities would be one, relationships between the White House and key agencies that have historically operated with some independence, the IRS, the Justice Department, the FBI, and so on. Two, how the administration that's coming in handles conflict of interest, something that all Americans should ask of any administration. Sure. To what extent are the rules followed? If there aren't simply rules that specifically speak to the question of how somebody with a particular business interest engages with a particular governmental function, are there norms that are being applied or concepts or policies or goals? And then three, ultimately, how much the statements of the leadership of the president-elect and now president turn into particular policies and what implications they have globally. So that's a critical set of challenges in a way, because it is always difficult to know how to navigate this moment when you have such geopolitical fragmentation, so much change in the developing world, so much change in governance, and particularly democracies and also technology. But I think here we're coming to see somebody with a very active change agenda, and the question is how much of that will be delivered on.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking a global perspective. We had an episode at the end of last year with Tom Carruthers, who heads our democracy program, about the trends, or whether we can call them that we've seen over the last year when it comes to democracy in the super election year. And Tom talked a lot about not just democratic backsliding, but also democratic resilience. And I'm wondering, we have seen some fairly impressive examples of that over the past few months. South Korea comes to mind. We've just this morning had the news of the impeached President Yoon having been arrested. Is there something that you think people here in the United States can learn from democratic resilience in an ally country like South Korea?
Yes. For one, they can learn that ideas spread, that what happens in a place like South Korea is somewhat influenced by what other leaders have done in other countries. So it's important to realize we are in a global conversation about democracy and its fate. Second, they can recognize the enormous importance of a free and independent media sector. There is, of course, the reality that right now so much information is transmitted and consumed outside traditional media channels. But to the extent people have a degree of trust in certain authorities, authorities is not even the right word, narrators, commentators, reporters, that can say, this is actually what's happening at the National Assembly right now. Here are the people who are showing up. Here's what's happening. Here's what people are saying. Here's what people are doing and not doing. That has enormous power, that ability to understand and converge upon something that is true, that you can hold on to. That epistemic thing is not just a theoretical discussion. It really matters to people's lives. And then third, that woe be it to the democracy where everybody just says, you know what? We're just going to stand to one side, deal with only the things that most directly affect our families. And, whether it's voting or protesting or serving in a jury or talking to people about something that seems to have gone off the rails, we're going to do something about it. Now, I hasten to add, of course, that part of what's been so challenging to see in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol that occurred 4 years ago is that there are many people who were adjacent to that attack or who perhaps even say something positive occasionally about that kind of movement that reflects that they kind of viewed it in a similar light, like we have to do something to protect democracy. And this is why I would particularly emphasize this point, that second point I made about some degree of ability to converge around what is actually true. Right. Here I would note that people have a right to all kinds of opinions, but democracy depends ultimately on the good faith and goodwill of people, including who have formal power, who are reporting on events in real time, who are making decisions about how to take a peaceful protest forward, right? And I think what was so moving to me about watching the Korea situation is we were talking about effectively peaceful protests, as well as some degree of restraint from the folks who had been ordered, to their surprise, to go and surround that National Assembly, and that ultimately comes together to protect a democratic system.
Yeah, no, that's really excellent. I mean, apathy as the democracy killer, but at the same time, the necessity to have an independent media that people trust in. Yeah,
there's the apathy point, and you've just rightly noted that there's also kind of the truth point. And here, it's very difficult to sit down and suggest that that's an easy thing. There are many contested meanings about many things, and that reflects in some ways progress, that there isn't just one narrative. But somewhere in between, like, there's a Walter Cronkite that tells you what's true and not true and kind of pretty much full stop. And then at the local level, the dominant newspaper, mostly, that tells you what you're supposed to be thinking. And at the other end of the spectrum, everything is contingent. That middle ground is inherently contested and complicated, and that's where we have to live.
And that's where Carnegie comes in, hopefully, which is, we'll get to that point later in the conversation. But for now, I want to stick with the theme of democracy, but broaden our lens and horizon a little bit beyond election cycles to look more closely at tech developments around the world. Among your wide range of research interests and areas of expertise, I would venture to say that in recent months and years, certainly emerging technology, their impact on public life, AI in particular, have been a big theme for you, and rightly so. So I really wanted to speak to you today about the evolving role, especially of AI in the realms of governance and democracy, because I think it's fair to say that for all its incredible uses, advanced AI systems complicate democratic governance at the very least, at home and abroad. We can think of concrete examples here: facial recognition, autonomous weapons, the use of AI in judicial sentencing recommendations. With your background, I'm sure you have a view on that. These have sparked debate about algorithmic bias, transparency worldwide. So what challenges, I guess, broadly, starting with this, posed by the new AI systems concern you most regarding their effect on future democratic processes? And how can public and private institutions in the US and elsewhere harness AI to innovate without compromising democratic values? Big question to start with.
Not surprise you that I think it's a good question and a super important one for Carnegie and for people around the world. The technology is progressing very fast. Let me make 2 points of context. Life expectancy in 1900 was in the 30s. Think about that for a moment. That meant that the average person, and yeah, it's true that a lot of that was infant mortality or whatever, but the average person born around the world was not going to live that long. Plenty of people lived past that, but the average is telling. Today, the average life expectancy is in the 70s. And that story of how we've more than doubled lifespans in a little over 100 years is not a story you can tell without an understanding of a kind of flywheel where human ingenuity and evaluation and progress and ideas go from a lab or from a conversation or from a set of tests that a company or a university is running into actual practice. And that runs through food safety, it runs through air quality, it runs through reductions in contamination of water, it runs through basic public health measures like vaccines, it runs through nutrition, and it runs through access to modern medicine. So it is a technology conversation, even though so many of these things that are so standard now, like a vaccine, that we don't think of them as an exotic or an emerging or cutting-edge technology, started off as that. That progress, to my mind, is profound. And it's a good counterweight to the idea that just because things seem to have gotten darker since that moment of wild optimism when the Berlin Wall fell, which is, at least within some of our lifetimes, that we can remember. And yes, 9/11 comes and great power, war returns and whatnot, but the broader arc of human life relative to 1900, to my mind, is, in general, somewhat less violence and somewhat longer lives, and technology plays a key role in that. The second point I want to make as backdrop to this conversation about AI is smartphones. We carry these computers that, by all definitions that are reasonable within our lifetime, should be described as really supercomputers with extraordinarily developed graphical capabilities and connective capabilities and even analytical capabilities. And we don't give it a second thought. And again, these things are moving from being exotic technologies to cars, to even more ordinary like paper or a pen, right? But a technology that unlocks a universe of information and of possibilities for surveillance and of connectivity, makes possible business models that were previously unheard of. In just 6 or 7 years, global use of smartphones went from about 3.5 billion to 7 billion.
Yeah.
So that's a very tiny indication of how fast this context is moving. So to ease then into AI, I would say we're seeing the same cycle with AI in both respects, that it is becoming commonplace enough for computing technology to do the things that previously we thought very, very sophisticated human reasoning was necessary for, like language translation. And now that's not even AI. At least it's not frontier AI. And then second, the uptake, the usage of chat models to increasingly infiltrate common functions that we do in any knowledge-based organization, like summarizing data, analyzing a spreadsheet and figuring out where potentially to trim costs, figuring out how to process vast volumes of archival data, for example, to understand patterns. That was not impossible to do 7, 8 years ago. You get a data scientist and figure out how to process and digitize the information. But a truly remarkable feature of even the pretty nascent frontier technology we have now, it's a contradiction in terms a little bit, but is that it's lay programmable. That without any real computing background, you can increasingly ask it to do pretty sophisticated things through a kind of prompt engineering. And that, to my mind, unlocks the enormous power of computing, as well as the risky things people can do with compute, and makes it available to a far wider group of people. It is important to remember at the same time, of course, that this technology is pretty nascent. So, yes, does it hallucinate? Does it fail to do some things that are very simple for some humans, particularly motor things? So robotics isn't what we thought it might be 20, 30 years ago. But at the end of the day, the two things that make me both most fascinated by and also concerned about the technology is how fast it is progressing, relatively speaking. How, for example, its mathematical capabilities are skyrocketing in a short amount of time. How it's beginning to rival fairly advanced mathematicians of what it can do mathematically. And also how social it can be, which is to say, it is not confined to somebody who has the real computing power, but it's becoming something that will shape our relationships with our workplace, with our loved ones, with our friends, with our networks, with our extracurricular activities, as it were. And it will be hard to separate ourselves out from those uses, for better or worse.
So you emphasized in your response there the fact that these new advanced intelligence systems are lay programmable, so they empower people everywhere, people like you and me. They also empower the big corporations, private sectors that come up with them, that have ownership of algorithms. If you think about governments increasingly relying on these companies for the management of this new technology, what risks do you see in terms of accountability, in terms of democratic oversight? And do you think these risks can be mitigated? Do you see any promising trends there?
That gets us to your point about what the threats and possibilities are for democracy. So let me address that generally and then get into some of the nuances and challenges here. So all democracy is about choice to some degree. There's no democracy if you don't have a real choice. And choice increasingly will be about the way these curated systems of information and manufactured or commoditized intelligence surround us, right? Can that be a good thing? Sure. A lot of the acts that we engage in democracy are complex. I think, for example, about voters in California and the nuances that are required to really make a sensible judgment of some of the initiatives that are highly detailed, highly complex, their impact on the budget, on the existing legal system, and so on. Can these technologies also help us bridge some of the really difficult divides that we have, where you know, and some of our Carnegie scholars who work on democracy know, that it's one thing to have a conversation among 7 or 8 people who disagree about something, and since where the disagreements are authentically based on clashing interests and the real values, and not submerging those with an artificial agreement, and where, in fact, it's really more of a misunderstanding or almost a surface-level cultural disagreement, and they can be bridged. So can I imagine systems that will help us do that to some degree? But where are the challenges? So one, the ease with which one can manufacture very fake, very believable information, that ease is going up. The cost of doing that is going down. The ability of personalized targeting you can do with those systems is going up. The decentralization of that, the access that very large swaths of people will have to design thousands or even tens or hundreds of thousands of appeals that are personalized to people, that is going up. Second, these systems are obviously poised, and we'll see how quickly that happens. It depends on a number of factors we can talk about, but poised to get ever more integrated into your daily life, to give you nuanced recommendations that you begin to trust. Whether you should or not is an interesting normative question, but ultimately a lot of people will find it convenient. I will probably find it convenient in some ways. So that gets to your point about, well, who controls how those systems are engineered. And the clunkiness which a lot of the existing large language models talk, quote unquote, about politics, give you a sense of how the corporate players are trying to thread the needle in some ways and not have this all be about polarized politics. 3, here's the more fundamental point. What choices that are democratic in nature can be delegated and what choices cannot? I think a lot of people might say it would be great to have a very dedicated, personalized bot that is trained to care about what Sophia cares about. They'll make it a little easier to navigate the California propositions. But what about a bot that is advising you on how to vote as a juror? A lot of people would draw the line there. I probably would too. So the judgment calls of how you unlock the convenience in the democratic process, the positivity, but at the same time keep humans firmly where they should be in making judgment calls. That will be an important feature of our democratic debate about democracy. And the second order version of it, there's a lot of judgment calls that we expect thoughtful governments to make about how to use weapons in real time, about whom to target in different ways, about where to impose financial sanctions. You mentioned sentencing. Will require a version of that conversation of what do we delegate and what do we not delegate.
So you mentioned the companies. If we look at the ecosystem, the personalities really shaping these technologies right now. I mean, you have a home base in California. The innovators there in Silicon Valley, many of them are still there. This used to be seen as a bastion of progressive politics. But, you know, over recent months and years, we have seen many of them change political camps, getting close to Donald Trump. That in and of itself is not a problem. But there is, and I've heard you talk about this, a pervasive sense sometimes with these tech entrepreneurs that they are beyond, above politics, above government. Do you see challenges there also when it comes to democracy in these technologies?
I think we are often reminded that in a democracy that is also a market economy and wants to live with a degree of flexibility and freedom to innovate, to let people live their lives in different ways, there's some inherent judgment calls that we all make about how that democracy should then balance the concentrated expertise, insight, stake in the success of, national level projects that a lot of companies or wealthy individuals have with the desire to maintain a degree of, every person counts, and we have a degree of egalitarianism, and we have some conflict of interest rules, but we also don't let the government arbitrarily separate people from their property. Like, those are hard, interesting, recurring questions in democracy. Yeah. And to be clear, they're not just faced in the U.S. They're not just faced at the national level. They're faced at the local level, too. I'm thinking a lot about the period in which California, coming to its own as a place that was truly part of the American ethos and a state, was struggling with, like, the role of railroads. On the one hand, the railroads literally connected and knit together the country, could engage in extraordinary feats of transportation, but gathered enormous political and economic power. And if you want to make sense of some important strands of California law that are with us to this day, they run through that sort of struggle of, like, how do we take seriously the important role these railroads play, but also that we don't want to make it easy for them to just give people a railroad pass where they can ride the railroads for free, but in exchange, feel sort of beholden to or inured in some way to the railroads and so on. So that's sort of one observation. I should note that also the way in which the structure of AI as a technology will intersect with questions about economic power and concentrated power are still a little bit getting defined. And I want to note that that does partly depend on company strategy and aspects of competition policy, but it'll also depend a little bit on what is technologically possible and also where the public and where governments go. So what do I mean by that? So it's one thing, if you go back to the days of AI when I started getting really interested in this stuff, which is, the 90s a little bit, and then I kind of put it on the shelf, got pulled into law, government, and all that, international affairs, but then always kept a little bit interested in it. But in the 90s, the conception of how the technology would work is that there'd be a big, giant machine. It was one machine, one model, as it were, running, almost like a giant mainframe. And you'd have to kind of be in the queue to ask it questions, as it were. We have instead a very decentralized reality, but one that still pivots on big concentrations of hardware power. As we develop AI models that are very, very heavily trained in very compute-intensive ways that make the inference process, or just querying the model once it's trained for a response to a question, and that the inference process is very less compute-intensive, we also can then kind of back-engineer how to get most of that functionality from the model with less training later on. That unlocks the possibility that many models that are pretty advanced could conceivably live on the edge of the computing environment and not necessarily in a server cluster. That also raises interesting questions about how much business models will develop around the idea that your trusted Sophia Besch model will be working with you and for you and less controlled by a larger company. The larger company might then come and say, well, there are incredible things this model can do to train your kids and tutor them that your more proprietary or more bespoke model that works for you and that you can trust can't do as much, or that you can trust in a different way. So the market will determine that in some respects, right? But what I want to add, to get back to your main question about how do we see this playing out over time, is in the end, I think what is beginning to happen more and more is that all these questions we've been talking about where compute lives, big clusters of very high-performance computing hardware necessary to do the training of the most advanced models, the relationship ultimately between the companies that are doing the frontier work in government runs through policy choices. And I think what has happened in Silicon Valley increasingly is a recognition that that cannot be denied, cannot be pushed aside just with an emphasis on the truly interesting, innovative potential that inventors and founders can have, which does play an important role, VCs and so on, investors. But also there's this question of where policy comes in, how the government spends money, where we make judgment calls about what needs to be sort of tested before or after it's deployed, how we make judgment calls about what other countries should have access to what technology, how we reconcile national security with purely economic considerations. So I think historically in the U.S., we have depended on the reality that the economic interests are not so aligned that they end up all in one camp, but instead they kind of have their own disagreements and rivalries. And in the end, it's not just one small faction of those disagreements that totally is in league with government. So my hope, let's put it this way, is that what we'll see play out actually over time, irrespective of how it might look right this moment, is a contending and disagreement that will keep the process a little limber and allow, therefore, for some really important judgment calls about how to balance, for example, widespread diffusion of the technology, our relationship with India, China, et cetera, versus national security considerations and various consumer protection considerations that should not crowd out innovation, but that require sort of conversations at the policy level. That's my hope, but we'll have to see what happens.
No, I really appreciate that. I mean, at this moment in time, it can all seem fairly aligned. So I appreciate the longer time perspective and the hope not just in the market, but the government will have a role, and we want disagreement. We want division for it to become a sort of fruitful environment.
Isn't that interesting that in a moment where people say, oh, we're so polarized, America's so divided, the world's so divided, we need more coming together. We are celebrating in this conversation to some extent difference among people who are wealthy or powerful companies, difference among people who are rank and file voters. Now, of course, you don't want that to become toxic and problematic for the core of the way we count votes and the way we hold people accountable through the law, but some degree of celebration of our difference and our ability to disagree within bounds, I think, is really critical for everything we associate with a functional democracy.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and then we'll talk about U.S. democracy, political economy, industrial policy, the growing influence of emerging powers on global systems, all of that in a minute. Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. Okay, we're back with Carnegie President Tino Cuéllar. In the first half of the show, we talked about U.S. democracy. We talked about the challenges associated with technological advances. I want to shift now to some of the policy implications of these rapid technological developments and the ongoing geopolitical competition over the benefits of these technologies. In short, I want to talk about industrial policy. I want to talk about U.S.-China competition. How effective do you think the U.S. has been in leveraging economic tools, tariffs, export controls, WTO mechanisms to pursue its interests in technological competition with China? And then I'm interested in your view on how U.S. industrial strategy is affecting global governance and multilateralism in turn, and whether there is a tension there between national U.S. interests and the international order as it has existed for the past few decades.
Sophia, let me try to be as much as I can sort of an objective analyst, and we'll probably get into sort of what's good normatively, but I'm going to try to leave that aside for a moment. So to me, the essential backdrop of all of this is the Cold War, because the Cold War helped organize global relations for a very long time, at least from, the very late 1940s through even, the early 1990s, where the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall still echoed as the U.S. thought in somewhat Cold War terms about the opportunities of reshaping the relationship with Russia, Eastern Europe, et cetera. China figures in that, a la Kissinger and so on. But in that time, it's very important to recognize that the U.S. always had not just a military strategy, but an economic and a societal one. The societal one being about making American life and the way of life America was associated with democracy, market economies, profoundly attractive to people. So you can just take a peek at the 1960 presidential campaign debate between Nixon and Kennedy, and there's discussion about, getting people from what were then called third world countries to study in the U.S. more, and why the Eisenhower administration not move faster to expand the number of visas. And soon thereafter, there was a giant compromise around migration to get the U.S. away from some fairly rigid and less defensible from a Cold War perspective country caps and into a system that's a little more flexible and a little more leaning into the idea that Emma Lazarus' phrase on the Statue of Liberty meant something, right? Yeah. So these things were part of a strategy combined with a military strategy, and then in turn combined with an economic strategy. And that economic strategy heavily involved public investment in the U.S., so think land-grant universities, R&D research, the highway system, the early investments and tests that led to the internet. But it also included a recognition that a doctrinaire approach to trade and capital movements would probably not work. So there was, the World Bank and the IMF, but there were also, and Alice Amsden is one of the people who's written nicely about this, the late Alice Amsden. There was a recognition that some U.S. allies that the U.S. was trying to support the development of, think South Korea, were going to have somewhat asymmetrical trade relationships with the U.S. That it was going to be easier for the South Koreans to sell here than we would allow it to be for us to sell there. So that asymmetry coexisted with a desire for international economic cooperation because the U.S. had a Cold War security rationale for it, to my mind. Fast forward to the present. We have the convergence now of a very different geopolitical picture. So a major strategic rivalry with China by most accounts from policymakers, a backlash against like very deep international economic integration in the public of developed countries, somewhat in Europe, more so in the U.S., and a different set of conclusions around what the U.S.'s own strategic and security interests are, such that If we need critical minerals for certain defense technologies and they're available in the open commodity market, we don't start from the assumption that that market is going to function without hindrances going forward. So this sort of neo-mercantilist thing is very poorly at a fit for the rather ambitious approach to trade especially, but also capital movements that the U.S. really leaned into as a kind of annex to the Bretton Woods arrangement following the end of the Cold War. So, all that is a long way of saying we're in a tough spot. Like how to reconcile some continued international economic cooperation, greater interest in controlling the flows of advanced dual-use technologies, more interest in securing tight supply chains, but also some realism about how concerns about inflation and about the well-being of consumers means an effort not to completely decouple from China or any other country.
Tino, there's so much more I would love to talk to you about. I really wanted to discuss sort of global emerging powers and changing power dynamics. You lead Carnegie, which is a global institution with centers all over the world, not just in what we sometimes think of as the West, DC, Brussels, but also Beirut, East Asia, New Delhi. There's a lot to talk about here and how, in terms of how the trends and themes we've been discussing apply to these regions of the world.
I think it is a really important challenge for Americans to understand that from the perspective of India, Indonesia, Kenya, Nigeria, I would even put countries like Turkey in the bucket, but especially some of these places that are struggling still with very large pockets of poverty at scale. Anything that we are interested in this country, U.S.-China competition, opening markets for American companies, global stability on our terms, is seen through the lens of how to bring billions of people into the global middle class. And I think we have some work to do in striking a lot of that balance without leaving aside strategic American interests that require all kinds of attention to issues that might put us in some contention with these countries.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've been struck throughout this conversation by your sense of optimism, really. I mean, optimism in the arc of progress, but also in individuals and their capacity to healthily disagree and to find consensus and to find information that they can trust. And so I, on that note, just wanted to ask you about your role as president of Carnegie and how you apply sort of the lessons that have come up throughout this conversation to this moment in time as a truth-seeking, peace-seeking institution in a polarized environment. How do you think about this job?
Sophia, I get spoiled because I got such terrific colleagues here. People are smart and they're practical and they're analytical and intellectual, but they're also mission-driven and they're independent thinkers, but they also want to know what they can do with their ideas and research to move forward in making the world a little bit less conflict-prone, a little bit more likely to cooperate sensibly and pragmatically, and improving governance. I love that. But I do think part of what is a balance we strike here is enthusiasm about the mission, but honesty about how fraught and complicated the world is. Also about the challenges we face as an organization where our primary lever is knowledge and ideas. That's our primary lever. We convene people behind the scenes. We train the next generation of scholar practitioners. But truly the core of what we do is supplementing and shaping the conversation and the policy agenda with a sense of how ideas point in one direction or another, highlight certain risks, highlight certain possibilities, and what the world can practically do about it with knowledge and with honesty. And I love that. I think it's an inspiring mission. I think you feel probably some commitment to that from our colleagues. But figuring out how to maintain our independence, how to be pragmatic but also scholarly, and critically, how to keep a time frame that is not just about the next 6 months, but lets us look ahead. I think that lets us be a little positive about a really complicated world.
Yeah. Okay, we've gotten to the point of the show where I ask my guests about a book recommendation. Any books, papers that you've read recently or over the past few years that you want to recommend to our audience?
So many. And I feel remiss and a little guilty about recommending because I often leave books about 2/3 of the way through and I have about 20 that I need to get back to the finish. But in the fine tradition of somebody who does that and maybe speaking to others who are willing to do that, I'll mention a couple books that I have found pretty fascinating and compelling recently. There is a book about India after Gandhi, which is a classic. It's pretty massive, long enough to be used as a weapon, I could say. but it's beautifully written, very scholarly and insightful. And for those of us who have an interest in South Asia, and that runs through, of course, a good bit of the work we do here at Carnegie, it's been very illuminating. The late James Scott wrote one of my favorite books ever, and that is a book called Seeing Like a State, which is about how grand and complex schemes to rationalize, count data, design technologies to solve certain problems can go awry, in part because they don't take seriously the tacit knowledge that humans carry around in their head. It's not so much a libertarian sort of tract, but it means to anchor conversations about how to make the world better in the practicalities and the humility that we need to deal with a very, very complicated world. And then there's a beautiful novel by Álvaro Enrigue about first contact between the Mexicas, the Aztecs, and the Spaniards, called You Dreamed of Empires. And it is just
I love that book.
a true delight.
Yeah.
It's one, it sounds like you've read it. I stopped reading it at the end and immediately started reading it again. Just a real reward.
Beautiful. Tino, it was a pleasure to have you on The World Unpacked, and I look forward to having you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. It was a delight. I look forward to it.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, Mira Varghese produces the show, and Clarissa Guerrero is our executive producer. I'm Sophia Besch. Thanks for listening.